Hey guys, tonight we're going to journey back to a time when scrolls were king and knowledge was a carefully guarded treasure. Imagine, if you will, the gentle flickering of oil lamps illuminating dusty papyri, the faint scent of aged parchment mingling with the crisp night air as you settle into a quiet corner. You're not in a modern, brightly lit library with rows of digital terminals. No, you're stepping into the surprisingly nuanced world of ancient Greek public access to written wisdom. You probably won't survive a day without a proper search engine, let alone a catalog system more advanced than a long shelf. Yet, even in this seemingly distant past, the seeds of our modern public library were being sown, albeit in ways that might make you chuckle, or perhaps just yawn contentedly. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story begins in the bustling, sun-drenched city-states of ancient Greece, particularly Athens. When we think of public libraries today, we envision grand buildings, free access, and perhaps a gentle, shushing librarian. But in ancient Athens, the concept was far more fluid, more organic, if you will. You'd find yourself wandering through the Stoa, those long, columned porticos, perhaps near the Agora, the central marketplace. Here, philosophers would lecture, citizens would debate, and occasionally you'd stumble upon a bookseller. Now, these aren't libraries in our sense, but they were certainly places where texts, in the form of papyrus scrolls, were openly displayed and discussed. It was a kind of open-air information exchange, where the act of reading was often a communal one. You might hear a passage read aloud, or join a discussion about a new philosophical treatise. It was a bit like an ancient Greek book club, but with more toga-clad participants and fewer artisanal lattes. Consider for a moment the mainstream historical fact that literacy, while not universal, was certainly valued among the Athenian elite and even a growing number of ordinary citizens. You weren't just expected to listen to oratory. You were encouraged to engage with written works, even if those works were privately owned. This leads us to a quirky tidbit. While there wasn't a dedicated public library building, wealthy Athenians often opened their private collections, sometimes called bibliothecae, for scholarly and intellectual gatherings. Imagine yourself, a humble citizen, invited to a symposium at a wealthy patron's home, where amidst the wine and philosophical discourse, you might actually get your hands on a scroll or two. It wasn't exactly lending out books, more like a very exclusive, very relaxed viewing party for texts. It was a way for these patrons to demonstrate their cultural prowess and intellectual generosity, much like someone today might show off their first edition collection, though hopefully with less danger of spilling grape juice on the priceless works. Now, historians still argue whether these private collections truly constituted public access in the way we understand it. Was it genuinely open to all, or was it more of a curated experience for a select few? The truth, as often happens in the ancient world, is likely somewhere in the hazy middle. You wouldn't simply waltz in off the street. You'd need an invitation, a connection, or perhaps a particularly persuasive argument about your thirst for knowledge. But compared to the rigid, closed nature of temple archives or royal scribal offices, these private bibliothecae offered a glimpse into a more democratic approach to learning. You might even find yourself leaning over a scroll with a famous philosopher, casually remarking on the latest thoughts on virtue or the merits of an ideal republic. It wasn't about lending limits or late fees. It was about the slow, deliberate absorption of ideas in a calm, almost meditative setting. The very act of reading was different too. You'd unroll the papyrus slowly, carefully, perhaps with a slight rustle. The words wouldn't have spaces between them, and there would be no punctuation as we know it, making reading aloud a common practice, even when reading to oneself. Imagine the gentle murmur of voices, each person deciphering the continuous flow of text, a soft hum of intellectual effort. It was a more immersive, less hurried experience than our modern quick scans and hyperlinks. It was about sinking into the rhythm of the words, letting them wash over you like a gentle tide. From the relatively informal intellectual gatherings of Athens, our journey now takes us eastward to a city whose name echoes through history as a beacon of knowledge, Alexandria. Imagine yourself, perhaps centuries later, stepping off a dusty merchant ship onto the bustling docks of this magnificent Egyptian city, founded by Alexander the Great himself. The air hums with the whispers of countless languages. The scents of spices and papyrus fill your nostrils, and in the distance, you see it. Not just a building, but a sprawling complex dedicated to the very essence of human inquiry. This, my friend, is the legendary Library of Alexandria, a place that, for centuries, represented the pinnacle of ancient public access to knowledge, even if its public nature was somewhat exclusive. The mainstream historical fact about the Library of Alexandria is its unparalleled scale and ambition. Founded in the 3rd century BCE, under the patronage of the Ptolemaic pharaohs, it wasn't just a collection of scrolls. It was a research institution, a museum, an academy where the greatest minds of the ancient world came to study, debate, and create. Picture yourself as a scholar, granted access to its hallowed halls. You wouldn't just be browse. You'd be immersed in an intellectual powerhouse, surrounded by the greatest thinkers of your era. It was less like your local public library, and more like a combination of the British Library, Oxford University, and a very quiet ancient tech startup. Now for a quirky tidbit. One of the most fascinating ways the Library of Alexandria acquired its vast collection was through rather aggressive acquisition policies. Ships arriving in the harbor were often searched, and any scrolls found on board were confiscated, copied, and then the copies were returned to the owners. The originals, however, stayed with the library. Imagine arriving in port, excited to share your latest scroll on Babylonian astronomy, only for it to be politely but firmly borrowed indefinitely. It was an intellectual eminent domain, a slightly sticky-fingered approach to collecting, but undeniably effective. One might even call it the ancient world's most comprehensive involuntary interlibrary loan system. Historians still argue whether the library truly had universal public access, or if it was primarily a resource for the scholars and elite invited to work within the Mausian. While certainly open to a wider circle than a private individual's collection, it wasn't a place where just anyone could stroll in to borrow a scroll for leisure reading. However, its very existence and the sheer volume of knowledge it contained meant that ideas circulated, scholars published, and the influence of its collection radiated outwards. Think of it less as a public lending library and more as a colossal engine of knowledge generation, the fruits of which eventually trickled down to a broader public. You can almost hear the soft rustle of thousands upon thousands of papyrus scrolls, each whispering secrets from across the ancient world. The very air must have been thick with the scent of knowledge, or perhaps just very old papyrus. The atmosphere inside would have been one of intense, quiet concentration. Scribes would be meticulously copying texts, philosophers would be deep in thought, mathematicians solving complex problems, all under the gentle glow of carefully managed light. You'd likely see shelves upon shelves, or rather, cubbyholes holding hundreds of thousands of scrolls, each one carefully labeled. It was an organizational feat that would make even the most dedicated modern archivist raise an eyebrow in admiration. And unlike the casual open-air discussions of Athens, here the focus was on preservation, study, and the systematic accumulation of all human knowledge. It was a serious business, designed for serious thinkers, but the sheer scale of its ambition was undeniably magnificent. As the intellectual light of Alexandria shone brightly, another center of learning began to ascend in the ancient world, eager to rival its glory. Our next quiet stop on this historical journey brings us to Pergamon, a city in Asia Minor, now modern-day Turkey. Imagine a slightly cooler, perhaps breezier landscape than the humid coast of Egypt, with a magnificent acropolis rising majestically above you. Here, amidst temples and theaters carved into the hillside, another grand library took shape, challenging Alexandria for intellectual supremacy. The mainstream historical fact about the Library of Pergamon is its fierce rivalry with the Library of Alexandria. This wasn't just friendly competition. It was a no-holds-barred intellectual arms race. The rulers of Pergamon, the Attalid dynasty, were as ambitious about accumulating knowledge as the Ptolemies. They poured vast resources into building their library and acquiring scrolls, desperate to outshine their Egyptian counterparts. It was like two ancient tech giants vying for market dominance, only instead of smartphones. They were battling over papyrus scrolls and philosophical treatises. You can almost hear the whispered boasts and scholarly snipes flying across the Mediterranean. Now for a truly quirky tidbit that arose from this rivalry. Legend has it that the Ptolemies, in a fit of pique or perhaps clever strategic maneuvering, placed an embargo on papyrus exports to Pergamon. Papyrus, remember, was the primary writing material of the ancient world, largely monopolized by Egypt. Faced with this shortage, the Pergamines, being rather resourceful, innovated. They refined the use of animal skins for writing, creating a new superior material that became known as carta pergamena, or parchment. This was quite revolutionary. Unlike fragile papyrus, parchment was durable, could be written on both sides, and could be scraped clean and reused, a true ancient erasable whiteboard. So, in a way, Alexandria's attempt to stifle Pergamon inadvertently led to a technological leap in information storage. It's a delightful irony, isn't it? Like trying to block someone from using paper, only to have them invent digital screens. Historians still argue whether the papyrus embargo was the sole catalyst for parchment's widespread adoption, or if its inherent advantages would have led to its development anyway. Regardless, parchment quickly gained popularity, eventually becoming the preferred writing surface throughout the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages, long after papyrus faded from common use. So, you can thank Pergamon, and perhaps Alexandria's pettiness, every time you see a beautifully illuminated medieval manuscript. Imagine the soft, smooth feel of a parchment scroll, perhaps a little heavier than papyrus, but far more resilient, capable of surviving centuries of gentle handling. The Library of Pergamon, while perhaps never reaching the sheer volume of Alexandria, was nevertheless an impressive institution, housing an estimated 200,000 scrolls at its peak. It too was a center for scholarship, attracting learned individuals from across the Hellenistic world. You would find scholars meticulously copying texts, debating the nuances of Stoic philosophy, or perhaps marveling at the newly developed parchment. The very atmosphere would have been one of studious quiet, punctuated by the rustle of turning pages and the soft scratching of reed pens. It was a place where knowledge was not just collected, but actively produced and debated, contributing significantly to the intellectual landscape of the ancient world. And all thanks, in part, to a little bit of ancient trade war. While the grand libraries of Alexandria and Pergamon often dominate the narrative of ancient knowledge, it's important to remember that access to scrolls and texts wasn't always confined to monumental state-sponsored institutions. Our next gentle exploration takes us into the quieter, more intimate world of private collections in ancient Greece, and how they sometimes blurred the lines of what we consider public. Imagine a hushed inner courtyard, perhaps in a well-appointed Athenian home, where shelves laden with carefully rolled scrolls provide a peaceful backdrop to philosophical discussion. The mainstream historical fact here is that many wealthy Greeks amassed impressive private libraries. These were not just vanity projects. They were essential tools for scholarly pursuits, political careers, and even for simple intellectual enjoyment. Think of a prominent citizen, perhaps an orator like Demosthenes, who would need an extensive collection of legal precedents and historical accounts for his work. These collections were often meticulously organized, sometimes by slaves trained as librarians, who understood the nuances of scroll storage and retrieval, a sort of ancient cataloging system, minus the Dewey Decimal. You might even find them complaining about a misplaced scroll, much like we fret over a misfiled digital document today. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some of these private libraries weren't entirely private. While not open to the general public in the way a modern library is, many wealthy patrons would grant access to a select circle of friends, students, or fellow scholars. It was a form of intellectual patronage, where the host would share their literary wealth, fostering a community of learners. Imagine being a young, aspiring philosopher and receiving an invitation to study within the personal library of a renowned thinker. You wouldn't be able to just waltz in off the street, of course, but the barrier to entry was social connection rather than an official membership card. It was like a very exclusive ancient book club with unlimited borrowing, provided you were on the guest list. Historians still argue whether the nature of this access truly qualifies these as public in any meaningful sense. Was it truly about broad access to knowledge, or more about enhancing the patron's prestige? It's likely a mix of both. These weren't public libraries as we know them, but they certainly served a crucial role in the dissemination of knowledge beyond just the owner. They acted as informal intellectual hubs, places where ideas could be exchanged, debated, and propagated, long before the printing press made mass distribution possible. You could almost feel the quiet hum of intellectual activity, the soft turning of scrolls, and the low murmur of respectful conversation as ideas flowed freely, if selectively, from one mind to another. These private collections were often much more than just a room full of scrolls. They could include reading areas, comfortable couches for reclining, and sometimes even gardens for contemplative walks. The environment was designed to foster learning and quiet reflection. You wouldn't find blaring music or distracting chatter. Instead, there would be a pervasive sense of calm, an invitation to sink deeply into the written word. It was a space where you could truly immerse yourself in the ancient mind, perhaps musing on the eternal questions posed by Plato, or chuckling at the comedies of Aristophanes. The warmth of the sun might stream through an atrium, highlighting dust motes dancing over ancient texts, a gentle reminder of the passage of time and the enduring power of words. As the influence of the Greek world waned and the Roman Republic, then Empire, rose to prominence, the idea of public access to knowledge underwent another fascinating transformation. Our journey gently glides from the marble halls of Greece to the bustling, grand cities of ancient Rome. Imagine yourself strolling through the Forum, the vibrant heart of Rome, and amidst the temples and basilicas, you spot something new: purpose-built structures dedicated to housing books for the populace. This marked a significant mainstream historical fact. The Romans were pioneers in establishing genuinely public libraries. Unlike the often exclusive private collections or the academically focused grand libraries of the Hellenistic East, Roman public libraries were a product of both imperial ambition and a burgeoning sense of civic duty. The first public library in Rome was established by Asinius Pollio in 39 BCE within his Atrium Libertatis. This wasn't just a collection for scholars. It was intended for the Roman citizenry. You could theoretically walk in, choose a scroll, and read it on the premises. It was a place for senators and soldiers, poets and merchants to engage with literature and knowledge. Though, let's be honest, you'd probably find more toga-clad citizens than your typical sweatpants-wearing modern library goer. Still, it was a remarkable step towards broader access. Now for a quirky tidbit. These Roman public libraries often came in pairs. Emperor Augustus, for example, founded 2 libraries side by side on the Palatine Hill, one for Latin texts and one for Greek texts. This reflects the bilingual nature of Roman intellectual life, where Greek literature and philosophy were deeply admired and studied alongside Latin works. Imagine the quiet hum of scholarly activity, punctuated by the soft rustle of scrolls being unrolled, some in Greek, some in Latin, a testament to the diverse literary heritage being preserved. It's almost like having two separate, but equally inviting, wings in a modern library, dedicated to different linguistic traditions. Historians still argue whether the primary motivation for these public libraries was genuine intellectual philanthropy, or simply another means for emperors and wealthy patrons to gain prestige and popular favor. Was it truly about enlightening the masses, or about leaving a lasting, impressive legacy? Probably a bit of both, as with most grand public works. Nevertheless, the impact was undeniable. These libraries provided access to a wider range of texts than ever before, fostering literacy and intellectual engagement among a broader segment of the population. You could immerse yourself in the epic tales of Virgil, ponder the philosophical musings of Seneca, or even delve into historical accounts of Rome's glorious past, all within a civic space. The atmosphere in a Roman public library would have been one of dignified quiet. You wouldn't be checking out books to take home. Reading was typically done on site. Picture comfortable benches, perhaps busts of famous authors adorning the walls, and the ever-present scent of papyrus and aged wood. Scribes might be quietly at work, copying texts, and attendants would be on hand to assist with finding specific scrolls from the armaria where they were stored. It was a space designed for quiet contemplation and serious study, a welcome respite from the cacophony of the Roman streets. And who knows, you might even overhear a senator grumbling about the latest tax edict while trying to enjoy a quiet moment with a scroll of Cicero. As we drift further into the quiet contemplation of ancient libraries, we must acknowledge that not all knowledge, even in these burgeoning public spaces, was destined to survive the relentless march of time. Our journey now takes a slightly melancholic turn, as we consider the scholarly debates surrounding the lost works and the sometimes fragile nature of ancient textual preservation. Imagine, if you will, standing amidst the ghost of a library, surrounded by the whispers of books that no longer exist, volumes whose wisdom has vanished like smoke. The mainstream historical fact here is deeply sobering. A vast amount of ancient literature, perhaps even the majority of what was written, has been lost to us. Think of the complete works of many Greek tragedians, whose names we know, but whose plays exist only as fragments or titles. Or countless philosophical treatises, historical accounts, and scientific observations that simply vanished. It's a bit like having a bookshelf where most of the books have simply dissolved into thin air, leaving only tantalizing glimpses of their former glory. This loss wasn't always dramatic, like a library burning down. Often, it was a slow, quiet decay, a lack of interest in copying, or the sheer fragility of the papyrus itself. Now for a quirky tidbit, one that underscores the haphazard nature of preservation. Sometimes, texts were lost simply because they were unpopular or deemed unimportant by later generations. Imagine a scribe meticulously copying a scroll, but choosing not to copy another because it was boring or outdated. What mundane ancient recipe book or overly detailed account of snail breeding might we have lost because it simply wasn't deemed worthy of the arduous process of hand copying? It's a whimsical thought, but also a stark reminder that what survived was often a matter of taste, utility, or sheer dumb luck, rather than a systematic preservation effort. It's like discovering that your favorite obscure fan fiction was never digitized because no one else cared about it. Historians still argue whether the destruction of major libraries, like the perceived burning of Alexandria, was the primary cause of textual loss, or if the slow, gradual process of neglect and the transition from papyrus to parchment played a more significant role. Was it a dramatic catastrophe, or 1,000 tiny erosions? The scholarly consensus leans towards the latter, emphasizing that the labor-intensive process of copying, combined with changing intellectual fashions and the inherent vulnerability of ancient writing materials, led to the vast majority of losses. You can almost feel the slow decay, the subtle fraying of papyrus fibers, the silent disappearance of words into the dust of centuries. Consider the ongoing scholarly debate about the precise contents of the Library of Alexandria. We know its rough size and reputation, but the exact titles and authors of all its scrolls remain a tantalizing mystery. Scholars painstakingly piece together evidence from fragments, quotations in other works, and ancient catalogs to reconstruct what might have been there. It's a bit like trying to solve a colossal jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing. And sometimes, a surprising fragment emerges from an archaeological dig, offering a tantalizing glimpse into a lost world of thought, like finding a forgotten page from a long-lost diary. It gives you a peculiar sense of hope, doesn't it? That perhaps somewhere, more quiet whispers of the past are waiting to be heard. Our quiet journey through the ancient world of public libraries now brings us gently back to the present, as we consider the enduring legacy these early efforts left for the modern reader. Imagine for a moment that comfortable armchair in your local library, the soft glow of the reading lamp, and the sheer volume of knowledge at your fingertips. All of this, in some subtle way, owes a debt to those ancient Greek and Roman pioneers who first conceived of a public space for texts. The mainstream historical fact here is that the concept of publicly accessible collections of knowledge, even if imperfectly realized in antiquity, laid the groundwork for the libraries we cherish today. From the private collections sporadically open to scholars, to the ambitious state-sponsored institutions like Alexandria and Pergamon, and finally to the genuinely public Roman libraries. Each step, however small, contributed to the evolution of a vital societal function. You wouldn't be able to Google a fact or borrow a novel from a digital shelf without the long, quiet lineage of human desire to share and preserve written wisdom. It's like tracing the gentle current of a river back to its humble ancient springs. Now for a quirky tidbit that connects the ancient past to our present, the very layout and design of some modern university libraries, with their quiet reading rooms and grand, vaulted ceilings, can often subtly echo the stoas and basilica-like structures where ancient texts were once studied. While we don't have scribes hand-copying scrolls, the underlying ethos of a dedicated space for learning and contemplation remains remarkably similar. Imagine the hushed reverence in a grand university library today, and you might just catch a faint echo of the quiet determination of scholars in ancient Alexandria, poring over fragile papyri. It's a pleasing continuity, a whisper across millennia. Historians still argue whether the spirit of ancient public libraries truly survived the collapse of the Roman Empire and the subsequent shifts in European literacy. Did the thread of public access truly continue unbroken, or was it rediscovered and reinvented in later eras? While monasteries and private collections certainly preserved knowledge during the Middle Ages, the idea of a civic, publicly accessible library largely faded, only to re-emerge more fully during the Renaissance and Enlightenment. The debate underscores how precious and often fragile the concept of shared knowledge has been throughout history. You can almost feel the weight of those centuries where books were scarce and literacy a luxury, making the ancient efforts seem even more remarkable. But despite the interruptions, the seed was planted. The ancient world, in its various experiments with public access to knowledge, demonstrated the profound value of centralized collections of texts. They showed that knowledge could be curated, organized, and made available, fostering intellectual growth and civic engagement. Think of the peace you find in a library, the quiet joy of browse shelves, the effortless access to information. This ease, this quiet abundance, is a direct descendant of the painstaking work done by ancient librarians and patrons. You might even find yourself unconsciously mimicking the posture of an ancient reader, leaning back, allowing the words to gently wash over you, just as they did thousands of years ago. The legacy also lies in the very materials we use. Remember the struggle between papyrus and parchment? The durability of parchment, born from ancient rivalry, directly contributed to the survival of countless texts through the ages, eventually leading to the Codex, our modern book. So every time you turn a sturdy page, you're experiencing a quiet triumph of ancient ingenuity. It's a gentle reminder that even the smallest, seemingly inconsequential shifts in the past can have profound and lasting impacts on our present tranquility. The soft murmur of whispers in an ancient bibliothèque, the grand silence of Alexandria's halls, the methodical work in Roman scriptoria. All these quiet moments contribute to the peaceful haven of knowledge we enjoy today. As you close your eyes, imagine those ancient readers, their faces illuminated by oil lamps, lost in their scrolls, just as you are now, lost in these quiet stories. The pursuit of knowledge, whether for scholarly research or simply for the gentle pleasure of learning something new, has always been a journey best taken in peace and quiet. Let that enduring, quiet pursuit lull you into a deep and restful sleep. Good night and sweet dream.